Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me so much pleasure to participate with you in this webinar today. The title of this webinar is Will Africa Become Another Tibet? Not to put a lot of confusion in our faces, my name is Atta. Let me put a name to this face. This webinar today, we have Professor Carole McGranahan and Gabriel Lafitte. Professor Carole is an anthropologist and a historian at the University of Colorado. I will not say much on Professor, as well as Gabriel, who is the executive director of Rukor in Australia. Please, before you do your presentation, Professor and Gabriel, if there is anything you want our African audience to understand about you, about the work you do, please feel free to do it. Without much ado, I'm going to open up for Ngodup La to give us an opening remark. Ngodup George is our friend, our brother, the Tibetan representative in the office of Tibet in Pretoria. Ngodup, you know, you always welcome. It's always a pleasure to have you. Sometimes your opening remarks are also so insightful as the level of a speaker. I'm going to please go ahead to open this event. Thank you.
Okay, Atta, thank you so much for the opportunity to say a few words in the beginning of this webinar, very important webinar. And I think it's a very right time that we organize this webinar, because Tibet has been, after its experience in dealing with Chinese for the last thousands of years, of course, and that dramatically in the last 60, 70 years, after the flight of His Holiness and the exodus of more than 150,000 Tibetans to India, we have been telling the world that what we had experienced, what you can learn from Tibet in Tibet and Tibetans in dealing with the Chinese. What is the overall game plan in the world, how they operate, sort of thing. But I think it has not been given that importance, or the world was not fully aware of the Chinese sort of the overall overarching geopolitics and geoeconomic game plan for the world and for the Communist Party. So because of that, I think that finally, I think the world has woken up, because a lot of the convergence of different factors, Chinese really, the single-minded focus on dominating the world and trying to export their sort of a totalitarian model of governance, and of course the economic, the domination. And finally, the world has, I think, woken up. So it's the opportune time that we hold this this sort of a webinar more frequently. So this is, and today with this, we have a very preeminent speaker, and Professor Carole and Gabriel Lafitte. They are very much fit in doing this, and once again for their support, and they're also sharing their expertise and their knowledge with our audience in Africa. And of course, there is this is a live telecast with the Tibet TV, so there will be more audience there. And once again, thank you so much for everyone, Atta and Gabriel Lafitte.
Thank you, Mike, please.
Carole, thank you so much. Okay.
We still can't hear you.
Is it? Okay.
Yes, it's fine now. It's fine now.
Okay, I have to just bow down. Okay, I will speak. Thank you so much, Ada, for the opportunity. And also once again, thanks Professor Carole and Gabriel Lafitte. And I know Gabriel for a very long time, and he's a preeminent Tibet activist, thinker, and writer. And he has been supporting Tibet for so long, you know, his lifelong. And Professor Carole also, I mean, since I've read few things about her, she has been sort of during her sort of a college gap year, she visited Nepal, and then how sort of a chance visit to Pokhara, Tibetan settlement. She met some of the Tibetan fighters from the Eastern Tibet after their demobilization from the Tibet-Nepal border. They will settle in Pokhara, and that's how she started that story, you know, and sort of understanding of Tibet's story and their strategy. So I think I'm saying that this is the very fitting time to have this sort of a conversation, because we have been speaking to the world that the world can learn a lot from the Tibet's of experience in dealing with the Chinese. What is their sort of a deeper strategic and economic strategy to dominate the world and export their the totalitarian model. So this is now fully manifested in front of us. So world has woken up, but a little bit late, but I think it's never too late. Thank you so much, Ata, for this organizing this webinar, and we hope in the next coming year we will have more of those. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ngodupla. It's a great pleasure again. We have all these webinars because we see the danger in the infiltration of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, within various important fabrics in African society, which is a danger to our existence. And that is why some of us say we are eaten alive if we don't wake up. It will also not be fair for me not to thank the government of India for giving a possibility for our Tibetan brothers and sisters to have a home in exile to live. Indian government, we thank you. We acknowledge the good work of thought leadership that you are doing towards the people of Tibet, giving them a place to stay. It's a great sacrifice in the midst of very porous and contaminated geopolitical games that are going around us. Without much ado, please, Professor Carole, we are listening to you. Please take us to what you know to do best. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in the morning here in Colorado. I'm going to try and speak softly so that I don't wake my family. So Tashidele and Tudite to both Ata and to Modip Dorjila. It's a pleasure to see your faces again and to join you in discussing Tibet. And in way of my background, what you just heard from Nodula is correct. I first learned about Tibet when I was a college student, and it was in 1989 in Nepal. So now 32 years ago, a long time ago. And at that moment, I learned the story of Tibet and was disturbed to realize that at the time I was age 20, that I had never heard the story before. And what made the biggest impression on me was the fact that the Tibetans had lost their country. And I wanted to know what had happened and why did the world not know about this? And I've dedicated the last, 3 decades of my life to trying to find out, what happened. How can those of us who are not Tibetan learn this history, support the Tibetan people, and then join others around the world who might also be in danger of the same, which is why this webinar actually is so important right now, is what are the lessons that the world can learn from Tibet, but also what are the alliances and what are the bonds that people who are also not as powerful, as some countries of the world and have to make concessions or compromises with China, how can they do that without losing their sovereignty? Okay, am I speaking loud enough? Can you hear me? Yes, okay. All right. So what I want to talk about actually are three things today. So the first is what happened in Tibet, right? What is the history of Tibet's loss of sovereignty? The second is the state of the world, both then in the 1940s, 1950s, and now. So a quick comparison between those two periods. And then three, a discussion of China as empire. And I think that is one of the most important things for us to realize, is that this is not just a conversation about global powers or powerful countries, but it's a conversation about empire, about imperialism, and about colonialism. All right, so to start with the history, just kind of for some people this might be new, and for others it might just be a quick refresher. We can start in 1933, which is when the 13th Dalai Lama dies. That happens around the same time as a civil war that's going on in China between the Republican Chinese, the Kuomintang, and the Communist Chinese, who at that time are up and coming. This starts in roughly the mid-1920s and goes all the way through the end of the 1940s. But it's important to note that the 13th Dalai Lama's death takes place during this moment. And he actually warns his fellow countrymen and women against the rise of the Chinese communists. So a very prescient kind of moment right there. 2 years later, after his death, the 14th Dalai Lama is born in 1935. He's officially recognized as the Dalai Lama in 1937, so just as a very young boy. And as a young boy, he moves to Lhasa and starts the training, both religious training and also some secular training, to become the Dalai Lama. But that doesn't happen until he's much older. So during this period, when the Dalai Lama is a young boy, the country of Tibet is ruled by, in English, we call them regents. But so by two, in this case, it was two men who had the power kind of in the interim to rule Tibet while the Dalai Lama was still a minor. Right? In 1949, and you can do the math here now, so the young Dalai Lama was 12 years old. In 1949, the communists win the civil war. And one of the very first things that Mao Zedong, right, the chairman of the Communist Party, says he's going to do is to liberate Tibet. We'll put that in quotes, because what does Tibet need to be liberated from, right? And he says we need to bring socialism to Tibet, and we need to liberate Tibet basically from the imperialists of the West. At the time, there were a handful, like literally you needed only one hand to count the number of non-Tibetan Westerners, who were in Tibet. But this is the argument, right, that Mao gives. Sadly, he is true to his word. And in 1949, the troops of the People's Liberation Army march into eastern Tibet. In 1950, they cross over the Drichu, which is a river that separates central Tibet from, separates eastern Tibet from another part of eastern Tibet, but allows the army to move toward Lhasa, Tibet's capital. They arrive in Lhasa, and they have such number, right, that the Tibetan government has really nothing to do but to sort of welcome them and allow them to stay. And initially, the government leaves. So His Holiness leaves Tibet, tries to negotiate. In 1951, the Dalai Lama's envoy is forced to sign something called the 17-point agreement in Beijing. This is against the wishes of the Dalai Lama, but it forges an agreement between the two countries that the Dalai Lama feels he can't fully repudiate in the moment, even though it was signed under duress. He returns to Lhasa, back to the capital of Tibet, and tries to make things work as best he can. In eastern Tibet, kind of by in some places 1954, in some places 1955, 1956, all of a sudden socialist new policies are being put into place. They're turning society upside down. Social policies, political policies, economic policies, and especially things against religion in the monasteries. So the local people in villages throughout eastern Tibet, the province of Kham, and also in Amdo, which is the northeastern province, start rising up. First, they do this individually from their own villages. Then they start doing this in collaboration, like different villages coordinating their actions against the Chinese, against the PLA. The one thing, however, is that Tibet then and now was a very small country. The population of Tibet was around 6 million. The population of Tibet was, of China was so much larger. So the number of soldiers that China has was exponentially larger than Tibet, but also China had modern weapons. The Tibetans were fighting with antiquated rifles and with knives, just their personal knives. The Chinese had tanks, they had bombers, they had machine guns, they had the weaponry of a modern army, that was not available to Tibet. So eventually by 1959, the situation had deteriorated such that the fighters in eastern Tibet had fled to Lhasa, the capital again in central Tibet. The army had followed them, and now there was a fear for the Dalai Lama's life. So in the middle of the night, the Dalai Lama fled on foot and on horseback, right, to the border with India. He crossed over in 1959 into India and has remained in exile ever since. So this has been 62 years. We're coming up on 63 years in exile. And I want to note very especially that no one expected this. His Holiness, his ministers, the Tibetan people thought that maybe they would be gone for several months, maybe perhaps half a year, and then they would return to Tibet. They thought that the world would help. What happened is that the world did not help in a substantive or significant way. It did not help in a way that has enabled the Tibetans to regain their sovereignty. So what I want to share now are kind of, how did this happen, right? So there's the timeline, right? And here we are now in 2021. But back in 1949, back in 1959, how did China accomplish this, right? So I've already shared that they had the military might and they had the sheer numbers in their population. Right. And so those were important factors. They also, however, had what we might call narrative power or discourse. And this actually reflects back to something when we last met on Zoom to discuss Tibet. China crafted the story. They were successful in being the ones to establish the global narrative about what happened, which is that Tibet was a feudal society and needed to be liberated and brought into the socialist world, which is what they did. So that was the initial narrative that they put forth, was that we are liberating Tibet from feudalism and bringing it in line with socialism. Later, that changed. Later, the narrative or the story that the Chinese government put forward was that Tibet had always been a part of China, right? So instead of making a claim that Tibet needed to be liberated, needed to be developed, needed to be modernized, the new strategy, right, in the claim to the world was that Tibet had always been part of China. So this was an internal political affair of the People's Republic of China. Also part of the story, and this one is key because I think it applies to different countries in Africa as well, was the idea that Chinese actions in Tibet were anti-imperial. And in this moment, if we think what's happening in the world, I'll get to that in a second, but just quickly, right? This was the moment of decolonization when European powers were being kicked out of different countries around the world, sometimes leaving on their own. So in the moment of European decolonization, China used the claim of anti-imperialism, right? That in terms of Tibet. And at that particular moment in history, that was a strong argument to be made. Okay. The other key point in all of this is that while this was happening, and again, that Tibet was in between Dalai Lamas, Tibet had not yet joined the United Nations. So it did not have the power of that global body, to call upon. Okay, so that sort of laying out the history of what happened. Now, let me quickly go through the state of the world. And here's where we can segue from the United Nations. So the world back then, right in the 1940s, World War II had just ended, right? This was a very different period in the world. It was kind of the reconsolidation of the world and different carving up, right, of kind of who had power, of who was allying with who, right, in terms of countries. Right now, in the 21st century, we are still operating in the legacy of World War II. That is still the state of the world that we're in, although we're starting to see it shift. If we look at the United Nations Security Council, those seats on the Security Council are still kind of pegged or linked, right, to World War II, right? China, France, Russia, United States, United Kingdom. These are the 5 permanent seats, right? And China gained that seat in 1972. Then we have the 10 rotating seats, countries that do 2-year stints. Currently, there are 2 countries from Africa, Kenya and Niger, right, are currently on the non-permanent, the rotating seats. But those permanent seats, again, goes all the way back to World War II. Right, in terms, so again, thinking of some ways the continuity of what started in World War II and that post-World War II era that's still determining how things are happening today. The question of empire remains with us. If we think of that decolonization happened in the 1950s or the 1960s for many countries in Asia, in Africa, or in Latin America, that is absolutely true. This is a period of independence and of rebirth and reclaiming sovereignty for many countries. For Tibet, however, it's the period of the loss, right, of independence, the loss of sovereignty, in some ways, ironically, right, in this moment of decolonization. And in the last 20 years, what we've seen is the realization that empire is not over, right? Classic European empire, right, of the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, right, from Spain all the way up through the British and French empires, right, that might be over in most places, right, although legacies, of course, still persist, and direct empire still persists in some places, including in the Caribbean for French Empire. However, in this post-World War II moment, during the Cold War, under the cloak of both anti-imperialism, right, and also anti-capitalism, 2 empires persisted. One is the United States, from where I speak to you this morning, but the other is China. All right. So in terms of thinking about how might we understand Tibet now, kind of in this context, in relationship to many countries in Africa, right, who have relationships with China right now, right? How do you go from being a sovereign country to being a colony, right, to being incorporated into someone else's country? Tibet at the time was very inward focused. Right, so this was a time in the world where Tibet was not focused on building ties globally. It had ties with its neighbors, right, diplomatic ties, but it did not have ties with countries that were not its neighbors, right, in other places around the world. Its focus was primarily inner and its own borders. So again, it was somewhat absent on an international stage. In terms of global politics, right, at the time, that made it a weak state. And I think this is important to note, right, that the countries in Africa who have been less successful, right, in negotiating strongly with whether it's Chinese mining corporations or Chinese government, or even just the flow of irregular migrants, right, have been weaker states. They have not been, it's not the DRC, it's not Nigeria. Well, for mining, DRC might be involved here. It's not South Africa, right? When I think of what are the powerful, the big countries that are anchoring kind of global politics on the continent of Africa. The last thing, however, to really think about in terms of this succession of kind of what did Tibet look like at the time in terms of the world then and the world now, is that really no one came to Tibet's aid. So at the time, there was no pan-Asian organization of countries that Tibet could call upon. Right? There was no equivalent of, say, the African Union or the EU or even, SARC that exists now for South Asia. So Tibet did turn to its neighbors to ask for help. India at the time, which had just in 1947 kicked out the British, after over 200 years of being there. The British like to call it that they quit India, but instead they were kicked out. So you also think about the verbiage you are using to describe, right, historical events. So India did welcome Tibetans in, and have been incredible hosts, right, for now over 6 decades for the Tibetans staying there. And yet this remains an informal agreement, right? Again, there was no organization of countries that was able to back Tibet in this moment. Again, and there was no international, such as the UN group, that came to Tibet's aid. And so I really want to mark that as well, that the world then in that formative moment, right, of creating out of the League of Nations, a United Nations, was not a body that Tibet could successfully turn to. And that, is actually a huge failure of both the United Nations, but also a fact of Tibetan history at that moment, right, that it had not fully entered the realm of global politics in that way. Trying to keep my eye on the clock here. 2 things that do match up between Tibet and China. When we think of how the Chinese government first went in to Tibet, I'll say it in English, but there's a phrase that many older Tibetans remember, which is that when the Chinese first came to Eastern Tibet, they would say, this is an English translation, the Chinese are like kind parents. The silver dollars rain down on us. And it was this idea of fraternity, of brotherhood. And if you look at China, the PRC, right, People's Republic of China's actions in Tibet, if we go back to the 1960s and to the 1970s and to the height of the Cold War, a lot of the infrastructure projects that China did in in Africa, this same sort of idea of socialist fraternity, of socialist brotherhood, that I think actually built kind of a legacy of goodwill for some governments, on which this new 21st century kind of imperial era is now happening, where we get, instead of, I don't know, the shaking of hands and the literal building of bridges, larger infrastructure projects, or ones where they're coming back in and redoing things. The extraction through mining really stands out to me as the most, in the building of debt, right? So these two things, which I'm guessing Gabriel will speak about later, but also a difference between, here we are again with story or rhetoric, or discourse, the idea that we are here to serve the interests of the Tibetan people, or say the people in Zimbabwe or wherever it happens to be, in Mozambique, versus we are here to serve the interests of China, right? So that is also a big difference between that earlier socialist brotherhood period of action, right? And the story now, and that we also see a similarity between what happened in Tibet and the progress in terms of Chinese explanations and justifications for their action there. All right, so I want to come to the final thing, and then I'll stop, which is the question of empire, right? What sort of empire is China? And here I want to say that empire is not singular, right? There's not just one way to be an empire. Empires are not just capitalist. They are not just European, right? By no means. Empires take all sorts of different formations. And this is actually part of scholarship that I have done with the historian and anthropologist Anne Stoller, which is to talk about the fact that empire never exists in a steady state, although it might claim to be so, right? But that is always something that is in formation, figuring out, what works best, right? What empire looked like even in the, classic heyday, again, of European empire, in Indonesia was not the same as in Kenya, was not the same as in India. Right? So there were strategies that were shared across empire. There were personnel, right, that were shared, and people who moved across empire, right? And so these connections, while sometimes were tenuous, were important at times. And so right now, however, what I want to say, what we're seeing is a new formation. So the Chinese presence in different African countries right now is not the settler colonialism that we see in China, in either Tibet or say in Xinjiang, right? It's a different form of colonialism. And actually it might be what we call imperialism rather than colonialism at the present. And here's also something to remember, that to be imperial is just as much to be a subject of empire or subject to empire as it is to be colonial, right? So empire does not require direct colonization. And here, this is also, again, what empire mostly has looked like in the late 20th and early 21st centuries in both its American and its Chinese variants, right? Is that it's as much imperialism as it is direct, actually it's more, imperialism than it is direct colonialism. We have mineral colonialism, you might say. We have debt colonialism. We have cultural imperialism, right? So all sorts of things. And again, the way these play out in different countries are not the same. And yet, if we look at the commonalities and the threads that might connect them, I think there's a lot that we can learn. Let me just quickly see here my final thoughts. For thinking about this, and actually in moving beyond Tibet, for both the different African countries, I'm thinking like Mozambique or Uganda in terms of mining, what's happening in terms of, for example, especially with mining, but also with the extraction of hardwoods or maybe different goods on the ground. We're also seeing this in the Asia Pacific region. So Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, in terms of Chinese extraction and, just the operation of different Chinese governmental firms. We're also seeing it in Latin America. And especially in terms of mining, I would say, look to what's going on in Ecuador and Peru, right, as well. And so it's about drawing, connecting the dots, right, and making these connections. All right, so finally, just to end, what I would say is turn and look to what are the weak states. At the time of the Chinese invasion of Tibet and the Chinese colonization of Tibet, Tibet was rich in many things, but it was weak in terms of global politics. That was not one of its strong points. It was one of its weak points. What are the states in Africa that actually are going to require the assistance of their neighbors, perhaps? What can the African Union do? What can the United Nations do? How do we do these things when China sits on the Security Council, right? How do you bolster a state that needs support, right, from its neighbors or from its friends? And I want to end kind of with something that has come up as I've been reading more ever since Atta and Lodip Dorjila asked me to speak to you on one thing that does link, I think, some of the states in Africa and Tibet. So I read a bunch of different scholarship by anthropologists on the Chinese presence in Tibet, and anthropologists look on the ground to what's going on with not necessarily government officials, but everyday folks, right? People just making their way through their lives, whether it's, market sellers or, the folks who actually work in the mines. And what came up again and again was the question of fakes, fake goods, right? Coming from China, whether it's fabric, right? So imitation batik or imitation West African prints, motorbikes, right? Imitation of Japanese motorbikes, imitation furniture, all of this. Even fake bodies of Chinese prostitutes, right? Discussed in Zimbabwe, and the idea of the fake. And what I want to share from Tibet is the idea of fake also, or Zuma, right? In the sense of reincarnations and the way that the Chinese have tried to put into place, right, individuals into religious roles who Tibetans do not accept as true and real. And that idea of the agency on the ground of actual people to respond to the imperial presence, right? And making decisions. What are we going to accept? What are we going to transform? What are we going to reject? And the acceptance or kind of acknowledgement that these interactions, these decisions, right, take place not in a relationship of equal, say, South-South relations, right, but relations that are imperial. And to recognize that that is a hierarchical relationship, right, that's been around for a long time, and that we need to recognize the new components of it, as well as the longstanding and persistent ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carole. I mean, listening to you, it's always mind-blowing. I can't wait for this pandemic to go away for us to really have you in our university space in an in-person conversation. I mean, I honestly enjoy. Jimmy, can you please mute Nomaginiati? Jimmy, okay, that's fine. Yeah, so I was just saying, Carole, that the way you have unpacked the history of Tibet, connecting it to why Tibet lost its sovereignty, and then the discussion that you have developed around China being an empire today, and the light that you bring into our mind on the various and what I would call new forms of colonialism, depth colonialism, mineral colonialism, these various forms that probably is still in the neglect in the African intellectual space, is of utmost importance, that deeper conversations are needed to really unpack each of these components. However, we will come to a few questions. I know with all that you've said, a lot of questions are burning in our minds. Meanwhile, without wasting much time, please, Gabriel, Lafitte, if you are there, if Jimmy could kindly display your presentation for us, let's get into it, and then we come back to a moment of Q&A, questions and answers. Thank you.
Atabongwoung, thank you so much for the invitation. I would like to see if I can build a little on the enormously rich presentation that we've just had from Professor McGranahan, and to look maybe a little bit further into these key questions of imperialism and colonialism in the context of China in Africa and China in Tibet, to see, where there may be parallels. But I would also mention that Carole is one of the few people who has actually written in depth about the actual history of what happened in the 1950s and 1960s. Months we have an amazing new book coming out for the first time in English by the Chinese historian Li Jianglin, a book called When the Iron Bird Flies. And she covers the same ground in enormous depth. And as a historian, she is able to look at it from the Chinese side and to quote Chinese sources that actually very strongly verified the history that Carole McGranahan just gave us. So that will be, in 2 months' time from now, an additional source for getting a sense of the tragedy of Tibet and whether it rings any bells, sounds at all familiar to people in Africa. So next slide. If we are not all that familiar with Tibet, it's important, I think, just to go right back to the beginning. Here is a map, which I'm sure everybody will recognize, of Eurasia from Turkey at one end to Japan and Indonesia at the other end. And right in the middle is this massive island in the sky, the Tibetan Plateau. People sometimes think, Tibet is some small, obscure, largely forgotten little corner somewhere in Inner Asia, but actually it's huge. The Tibetan Plateau is the size of the Congo. It's the size of Western Europe. It is truly enormous. And that, I think, is a really, really important point to make, because we need to understand that Tibet is a colony, and it's a big colony, and that, as Carole said, China has had the power for the past 70 years to remake Tibet in China's image, to serve China's needs in ways familiar to anywhere with the history of being colonized by a power that declares it is on a civilizing mission. And again, I would imagine that in Africa, that is a phrase that has very, very strong resonances. Carole, I think, was exactly right in saying that the European empires are not the only kind of empire. So there are obvious differences. But if you look at the actual outcome for the Tibetans of 70 years of living under Chinese control, just look at, one obvious measure, actual incomes across rural Tibet. And I'm basing this here not only on, my own 44 years of involvement with Tibetans, but using China's official statistics. What they show is that Tibet is very much part of the global South. Countries with the comparable purchasing power parity are Guinea, Ethiopia, Gambia, Mali, Togo, Burkina Faso, and Afghanistan. And that is according to the World Bank. The World Bank tracks poverty levels in 188 countries, and on that basis, Tibet would be number 168. So when China proclaimed socialism and consistently labels the Tibetans as backward, primitive, uncivilized, living in darkness, and that China was the bringer of light, modernity, urbanization, a global language, entry into history. Does this sound familiar? Does this remind us of the language used by the European imperialists in Africa? China consistently depicts Tibetans as weak, in need of a blood transfusion from the stronger elder brother, that is the Chinese. Well, that is just simply arrogant, racist nonsense. So, yes, next slide. China proclaimed, as Carole has already told us, that socialism will bring liberation, prosperity, a new heaven on earth, railways, cities, electricity, progress to areas that have lived outside of history and only in feudal darkness. So this is why I'm inviting you to think about ways in which this sort of civilizing mission might sound familiar to anywhere with a history of being colonized by a power that declares it has a civilizing mission. So next slide. This is a slide from a video, a propaganda video made by China. And if you play the video, you will see that China these days is taking a really sort of quite aggressive attitude to what it sees as the violence and lawlessness of African bandits who are interfering and attacking the railways that China builds across Africa. And in this video, this cargo ship suddenly transforms into a gunboat, with bristling with guns and, you know, firing on and scaring away all those naughty Africans who dare to question China's role in Africa. Next slide. Now, in Tibet, China similarly proclaimed that it was bringing modernity. Here we see in the background the mountains for which Tibet is famous, but the eye is drawn naturally to the bridge carrying a train, the train bringing modernity to Tibet. And here are all those happy native Tibetans in their timeless, traditional, historical costumes, dancing and waving ceremonial scarves with joy at the arrival of the train and bringing with it everything manufactured in China. What China did in Tibet was in many ways a rehearsal for the way it is now extending its reach and its power and its capacity to extract minerals from all over the world, and to call it development, to call it modernity. China is now a global exporter of what it did in Tibet. And let's just list a few of them: hydro dam construction, power grids, railways, highways, and mines, extracting copper, gold, silver, lead, zinc, molybdenum, lithium, oil, gas, etc., etc., etc. So much so that when China now wants to show African elites, governing elites, what it can do for a particular African country. It often takes those delegations to Tibet as a showcase, a showroom, a sales room, to show off China's capabilities and then seal the deal. However, China's approach, and this is typical of empires, is top-down. That means the local communities are not involved. There is no co-management. There is no engagement with local communities. There is no knowledge transfer. There is only one way of doing things, and that is China's ingrained state-centered or statist way. China actually boasts that it is a global creator of public goods, and yet it deals and signs deals and seals deals only with governments, and the local communities are excluded. That has lots and lots of consequences. However, China at the same time calls itself a leader of the global South, even though actually everybody knows that China is now rich and fast getting richer. How? How does China do that? Its model for growing wealthy is actually, when it comes down to it, really quite simple. Let's go to the next slide. It imports raw materials from Africa and worldwide, transforms them in China into manufactured products in Chinese factories, and then sells their industrial output back to the world, including Africa, which of course is highly profitable. And China is now the processor and manufacturer and almost the monopoly producer of a very wide range of minerals imported into China, both from Tibet or Congo or Peru or Zambia or Sudan or Mozambique or Angola or many, many other countries. So when China first manifested on the vast grasslands of Tibet, as Carole McGranahan told us, it presented itself as a bringer of science, of enlightenment, of modernity, of progress. So what you see here in this propaganda poster is by far the biggest and the most prominent person is the Chinese People's Liberation Army soldier in blue. And he's physically bigger than any of the Tibetans, although in reality, the Chinese are often rather scared that Tibetans, especially from Eastern Tibet, are actually physically very big. So what is this Chinese soldier doing? He is showing a young Tibetan boy and the Tibetan boy's father, who are dressed in furs and animal skins, and everything is utterly traditional. Trigonometry, how to triangulate the world, how to turn your homeland into numbers, how to calculate distances and heights, and therefore plan, therefore live not in the present, but in the future. So this, one Chinese man with his theodolite and his surveying instruments is single-handedly bringing modernity to the land of darkness. Now, when China does the same thing in Africa, making Tibet part of its Belt and Road, but equally extending its Belt and Road all over, right across Asia, into the furthest reaches of Pakistan and Xinjiang and across Africa. those peoples, those nations, those nationalities who struggled to be free of European colonizers and to assert their right to self-determination, won. They won that battle. And yet, although they won, colonialism and above all imperialism were not ended by national independence. And China in Africa these days is known for sending large numbers of Chinese managers and Chinese workers to actually do the work of building the railways, operating the mines, and adopting quite brutal labor practices that are very reminiscent of the brutal attitudes of the European imperialists. So much so that if you turn to somebody like, say, Cliff Mboya, the son of the famous Kenyan trade union leader, Tom Mboya, and Cliff Mboya is educated in China, speaks Chinese, is very much a supporter of China. And yet when he looks at China's labor practices in Africa, he explains it as, and these are his own words, Chinese investors and companies are coming to Africa to reap as much profit as possible. The problem is this work can't escape the history of how colonialism organized African labor and how that organization shaped African societies. It's no surprise that pursuing maximum profit in an environment running on a colonial pattern of labor exploitation will end up replicating that exploitation. Next slide. So when China sees remote areas as sources of raw materials for the enrichment of China, and within China, most Chinese, and certainly the richest Chinese, live in the eastern provinces. And they regard Western China, which includes Tibet and Xinjiang, simply as sources of raw materials. This map shows you the power grids transmitting electricity over vast distances from Western Tibet, Western China to Eastern China, from Tibet and Xinjiang, from the oil wells and gas fields and coal mines of Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, and above all from the hydro dams being built on the many great rivers of Tibet that come down from that vast island in the sky. China promises also to electrify Africa and to transmit electricity again over vast distances. But is this approach suitable or necessary or viable even in today's world? Next slide. If we look at the situation in Africa where I think this is in the next slide. If we look at, sorry, let's keep going. I'll come back to that one. There's a slide that's got a map of Africa in quite bright red. One more. No, one more. That's it. Okay, sorry. I'm jumping about a bit here. We'll go back later. This map, which was published only a month or two ago, is a reminder that there are still many, many, many people, especially in Africa, but also in India and Pakistan as well, who still have no access whatsoever to electricity. China's promise is that China has a unique capacity, unique technology, a unique willingness to invest in the hydro dams, the oil wells, the extractive mines, and in the power grids that will create electricity and solve the problems of people throughout rural Africa. But if you look carefully at this slide, you'll also see on the left, on the bottom, some indication of the photovoltaic, the solar energy revolution and the wind energy revolution that's now well underway all over the world. And in fact, there's simply no longer any need for highly centralized power grids to be the only way that electricity can be delivered. It can all be done by local communities, in local communities, by local communities, without huge capital expenditure. But China wants to do deals, mega projects for mega millions between Chinese state-owned corporations and African governments. If this all gets decentralized and made part of community life, then China loses that degree of power, of control, of establishing a patron-client relationship with African governments that become obliged to their Chinese financiers rather than being accountable to their own population. That is imperialism. That is the great danger. Now, China says it's changing its ways, and I'll finish with one last quote. Last month in Dakar, in Senegal, China met with the leaders of 54 African nations. China calls this a meeting of two sides, although actually there are 55 countries. China promised, and again, this is a direct quote from what the Chinese government said at the conclusion of this meeting of China-Africa cooperation. The two sides will continue to support expansion of industrial chains in the mining industry, increase investment in smelting, processing, and other upstream and downstream sectors of the mining industry, as well as electricity, transportation, and other supporting infrastructure, launch mineral processing projects in African countries, and build resource development cooperation zones to promote local industrial development. Now, that is exactly what China has failed to do so far in Africa. Do we suddenly now believe that China is going to empower local communities? Well, again, I invite you to look at the history of Tibet and see whether you can see the parallels, because for Tibetans, what they face now, 50, 60 years after the period that Carole McGranahan just explained to us, that quite literally, Chinese corporate boardrooms far away from Tibet, and even further away from Africa, are literally choosing between Katanga in the Congo or Kham in eastern Tibet for the next copper mine. That is how the real world works these days, all to be shipped as semi-processed concentrates to China, turned into pure copper products, and then exported back to the countries where the copper originated at a massive profit. That is a form of exploitation. So I would invite you to look closely at the way China behaves in Africa, its bad labor record, and in the context of Carole McGranahan's introduction of empire and colonialism as a frame that we need to use to understand what's happening right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. There is a lot that you have said. The question that probably I will be asking my friend Godu is, I think 1 hour to listen to both you and Carole is not enough. We won't be making such a webinar with a deep insight as if it's a football match of 90 minutes or less than 90 minutes. We don't have much time anymore. Before I open up for questions and answers, I would just want to ask Carole one question and probably to ask you, Gabriel, one question, but with a little margin of extension. Professor Carole, listening to you when you started talking about the approach that China used to enter Tibet in the context of, liberating Tibet, and it's almost the same of a different kind that China is really penetrating African societies in the context whereby they expounded so much on the win-win relationship. But when we look at critically the index of this win-win relationship, we realize that it's more than what the eyes can see, because already China has a military base in Djibouti, which is in Africa. And then the question on this win-win context is, what is then the need for a military base? So I know you are very professional in what you do, Carole. My input to you is not so much of a question, but could you, like a message of caution to the African communities, would you mind to a little narrow on the Tibetan experience and to have a word of warning for African societies to say, look, if you wanna escape the tragedy, the Tibetan tragedy, is probably this is what and how you should handle yourself, or let's say behave yourself, because there are a lot of things that are not tying up. And I enjoyed when you talk about the Tibetan society as a whole, its relationship with external powers, the world at large, and how much that relationship was not so much strong, such that the world could have, probably intervened to give so much of support to Tibet. And if you could probably, by warning Africa to also tell us probably what approach African can do to create more awareness within the Tibetan struggle that will probably create a kind of consciousness that becomes so alive among Africans. Because, Carole, we are eating alive. We can see it. You see, these things, yes, they are intellectual. Yes, they can also be understood and be grasped by even people in the grassroots level. I'm not sure if you have captured the essence of what I'm trying to highlight, that you speak to us as the African audience. And then the question that I would like to ask Gabriel, if Gabriel can take it, can take note of it, is, yes, we've understood the politics about, issues pertaining to development, modernity, and we see how you've highlighted it so much, especially when it has to do with Chinese labor market, even the infrastructures that they built in Africa, they use Chinese labor and so on and so forth. But one thing that I will tell you, Gabriel, that is so much of a concern to me is that much of these infrastructures that the Chinese construct in Africa are not so much of the things that we need. They're basically things like football stadiums. I mean, not every African is interested in football. And with these football stadiums that after a football competition, the stadiums cannot be managed by African government. Not only that the stadiums cannot be managed by African government, they leave Africa with so much debt. And you know, with the issues of debt, it's just this politics of, you know, conspiracy of denial that we find in a lot of African countries. For example, recently, the Ugandan airport is almost taken. But you hear a different story from the government of Uganda, you know, this denialism and all these things. So, Gabriel, why do you think China is so much interested on its approach, which you coin it as a top-down approach in Africa? And possibly, Gabriel, do you think there might be very soon we might experience a stronger anti-China resentment or an anti-China revolt from the masses, the Africans who are at the bottom of the pyramid? Because from the context of this top-down approach, one of the things that we've observed is that only African politicians are on top. The people have no connections with the Chinese. And there are a lot of maltreatment that the African people are receiving from the Chinese people. If you can handle that, then I'll open up for 1 or 2 questions, then we're out of here, please. Thank you. Carole, over to you.
Okay, wow. This is a deep and rich discussion, and those are a lot of questions. Let me just quickly go into the topic of military. So again, China is not the only empire operating at present. And I did see in the chat that there was a question also about, is Islam an imperial formation? And I would say certain aspects, yes. But where I actually want to go right now is that the United States currently is an empire of bases, you know, of military bases around the world, including in Africa. And so it's not just China. And I think you're right to point this out, to make that connection between the military power that the Chinese had in Tibet in the 1950s and continuing to today. And the way that actually, in some ways, it's very stealth. The way that the spread of military bases around the world has certainly been part of US, American, right, imperial strategy in the late 20th and continuing to the 21st century, but also one for China. And just to give one additional example from Africa, although not a Chinese one, is the example of Diego Garcia, right? The island of Diego Garcia and the Chagasian people, who basically have become, it's like a joint colony, right, between the UK and the USA, and have lost their sovereignty. So there actually is an example of a continuing, not just colonial, but imperial loss of sovereignty, right, in the present. So that would be one thing, right? To pay attention to the spread, to all of the different components, right, of what an imperial presence, again, whether it's Chinese or whether it's American, or whatever particular geopolitical formation is operating in the world at the time. This is the moment we're in now. 20 years from now, we could be having a very different conversation, right, about the rise of someone else. The awareness kind of with this, and I want to use kind of a photographic metaphor of having both a wide angle view and then also a zoom view, and here we are on Zoom, and streaming live, but to go in and to look at the details again of everyday life and not just of governmental negotiations, right? I think as we heard from Gabriel, the Chinese government is negotiating with other governments, although consolidating them into one, right? That this is what did he say? A two-side conversation, right? China and Africa, as if Africa is a singular unit. Or as a southern country, right, as I ended my talk with, but to really look at perhaps what we would call citizen initiatives. And that actually was one of the main things that I studied initially, was looking at Tibetan citizen responses, right, to the Chinese. Citizens were able to respond in a way that the Tibetan government was not. What are the abilities to join together, to cooperate, to create, to act in the present? Just because, you know, the United Nations formed post-World War II and we are still in a post-World War II, again, doesn't mean we will always be in this moment, right? What sort of global restructuring is taking place right now, not just at the level of government to government, but citizen to citizen. Worker to worker, perhaps, right? To think of laborers, to bring in all of the people who might actually join forces to not just demand change, but to create change. And for me to pull it back now to Nepal, where Dorjila started us, I think of a phrase from Nepal, Kanidesh. So for anyone here who speaks Nepali or knows Hindi, like the idea that some countries are the ones that eat other countries, and some countries are the ones that get eaten, and to turn that around. Right. And again, to insist on a new, start locally, a new order, a new set of rules for how we're going to act, what we're going to take, what we are going to refuse. Right. And leading to some sort of new global order. Again, nothing is static. Right. The moment we are in now is not the same one we were in 50 years ago. It's not the same one that's coming. But to find those other people, right, to join forces with, to build the future that might seem impossible, but still to insist, and to insist perhaps loudly, right? That we are moving in a new direction. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Carole. Gabriel.
Yes, thank you, Atabongwoung. You said, and I think this is exactly the point, that what China builds is not what we need. And I think that identifies, you gave the example of stadiums, and that identifies exactly the problem. Whether it's stadiums, mines, hydro dams, ports, the power grids that connect them all, the highways and the toll roads that connect them all, showy, grand buildings in capital cities. Why is it that China invariably turns to mega projects with mega scale? It's partly obviously because that's where they have the technological advantage. It's where they can compete with Western companies and export what they're good at. But above all, it is what they call a win-win. But who are the two parties that are winning? Well, on one side, it's obviously Chinese corporations or the Chinese government working together with Chinese corporations, Chinese banks. But who is it on the African side? It's invariably elites. It's invariably governments. And as I said earlier, if China can establish a patron-client relationship with an African country, then the elite of that country actually has more loyalty, more concern, more engagement with China than it does with its own population. Its own population actually loses the ability to hold its own government accountable because that government is getting its magnificent promised development that it can say, you know, if we can only export our copper to China, if we can only build the port, if we can only build the stadium and have a glorious future as a sporting nation, launching spectacular political events in that stadium, then we will all be better off. This is beneficial for everyone. But in reality, as you said, it's not. So I do think that Carole was right to say that imperialism can take many forms, and that we really do need to sort of think very carefully whether China's initiatives in Africa actually meet the needs of African people, African communities. That is not a question that I, as an outsider, can answer, but I would like to raise the question in the hope that there can be, more debate on that in African countries.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. I am opening up now for conversations, comment, questions, probably limited to just 2 questions for the day. And there is a question, I'm not sure whether it's a comment from Nikki. Nikki says, could Carole please go further into the take over Islam in Africa? How will China counter Islam there? For example, the Uyghurs. I'm not, Nikki, if you can hear me, please, I'm not so sure of your question. Would you mind just turn on your mic and then paraphrase it to Carole, please?
Yes, I'm intrigued because the Muslims have now nearly a military power in parts of West Africa, and I don't see how the two will come together, or how will it all happen? What will happen to Africa and the overtake of Islam? And then the Chinese there too.
Well, I wouldn't count on China being the ones to engage Islamic militants in Africa unless they're directly threatening their minds. In which case, then we have an entirely different situation. And here's where I want to say, I actually I am not an expert on, Chinese mining in Africa, nor Islamic militant groups. So I don't want to speak out of turn. China, however, I think has been made clear in this conversation, as are most empires everywhere, are operating in their own interests, right? So the goal would be to defend Chinese material as well as political interests, and bringing in the question of militant Islam, as well as just kind of the spread of Islam in Africa, as I hear your question more broadly, right? As a new ideology, as a new way of life, and not just a religion, right? That has really risen in the last, 2-3 decades, and not just in Africa, but in other parts of the world as well. And that's what I'm talking about with things like what sort of new imperial formations are operative now that we haven't even fully named, right, and thought about. So this is, I feel, a question that I can't answer, but I think it's an important one to consider, right? Like, what has changed? What is in motion right now that is impacting people's lives in ways that are really significant and not always positive, and yet people don't know exactly what to do, and governments are certainly often don't have the tools, the strategies, right, or the resources, to fully react in ways to help. So sorry, a non-answer, just an acknowledgement. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carole. I think Nikki can draw much inspiration from that. Chinese presence in Africa obviously is an issue of interest, and the more interests are being achieved, the more empires are sustained. So in a nutshell, it's just to say that I am very convinced China will go to an extreme to crush whatever comes in between their interests, because one of the agenda of Imperial China is to reorder the global world order, where China is so adamant to become a global hegemon, which we see in all the various ways that they are setting their various imperial mechanism or machinery to be able to achieve that. And the unfortunate part of it is that the African society are experiencing a new kind of an enslavement, which is it's around the debt trap, which of course Gabriel has so much mastery. Probably in his conclusion remark, he may just want to talk to that by some kind of projection into what Africa might become as a result of this debt trap. So in my own view, in as much as, you know, Islam and terrorism or whatever is important, there is something that is passing in between our legs, which is we must pay more focus and attention to it, which is Chinese infiltration into grassroots agencies within African society. There was a time in a village in Ghana, I saw a Chinese was crown chief in that village. So these are not things that we need to sleep an eye over. We need to really put an eye on that. And you remember, Nikki, a few months ago, there was when this member of government in South Africa died, there was a Chinese lady that was, I don't know if she was already installed at the parliament and she was about to take over, and there was, you know, an uproar until I think that project did not achieve its essence. So yeah, your question is good. I think things, as Carole mentioned, we will just be seeing how things are unfolding, because there are a lot of things that we cannot put a form or a shape to. But in the course of time, we'll be able to understand, you know, various dynamics that will enter into this, whether it's China-Africa relationship or whatever. Gabriel, your comments, please.
Atabongwoung, I think you've already covered it. I think China is slowly learning to do things in a way that is a bit more flexible, but still the bottom line is China's path to prosperity is to exploit, to extract raw materials from Tibet, from Africa, and then sell them back as, you know, finished manufactured goods. That is the secret of China's rise. And if you look at the history of European imperialism in Africa, in Asia, that sounds very familiar.
Colleagues, if you have a question, you can raise your hand. There is an icon below your screen, which you can identify yourself, and then we will be able to allow you to ask your question. If there are no questions, I'm sure I'm not speaking on behalf of the Office of Tibet, but I'm just informing my friend Godupla that as soon as the pandemic is over, let's try bringing Carole, Gabriel, and the others to South Africa to see if it's going to be more impactful than the webinars that we are doing. Because I am sure in holidays, South Africans often are caught in between restaurants and, you know, especially in this festive period. So we will probably look into having an in-person meeting to also evaluate in impact as to compare with these episodes of webinars that we are doing. Ngodu, please, you mind giving a closing remark?
Okay. Ata, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to say something as a closure of this webinar. And I think, thank you so much, Professor Carole and Gabriel Lafitte for a very, very in-depth talk on this subject. And I think they have been able to go very, very deep into the subject, you know, not just the newspaper headlines or a little bit here and there, but really the root causes, how everything is operating behind the headlines. And we have learned a lot. I hope the participants on the Zoom, as well as on the post on Facebook, they have learned a great lot. And I think this is something that we need to, as I said in the beginning, that this conversation we need to continue further. This is, I think, one of the series in one first, and so I think that's great. And thank you all the participants, those who are on Facebook as well as on the Zoom for your support and for have the passion to listen to the talk, because such topic is a little bit more hard, but for your support and also for the speaker for your time, and especially the Professor Carole. I mean, you just got up at 4:30. The other people must be sleeping in a deep sleep, But we for this, we have woken up you so early, and for your time, and also I think would be soon, Dr. Atab. But Atab, for your really support and organizing this talk, for your time. And we are very much appreciated for all your effort, and also the participant and the speaker for their sharing the knowledge. So once again, thank you so much. And we hope that we have been telling actually that what the Tibet's experience with dealing with China, we have been speaking this for so long, and now world has slowly woken up that they need to take Chinese seriously and learn some lesson from Tibet. And so hope the countries in Africa, they will pay more attention to the plight of Tibet, so that they may not fail or fall prey to this same fate as the Tibet. Okay, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Godubla. Colleagues, apologies. With these festive things going on, there is a birthday party I must attend in Johannesburg. I think it's making me to lose my mind, thinking of the birthday goodies, the drinks and the food. I think I'm almost losing it. My apologies. I had some people that I promised to give them an occasion to just say a word in this webinar. It is the Tupten Giato, the deputy. Please, my apologies, sir. My mind is already in Johannesburg while I'm seated in Pretoria. Could you unmute yourself and just have a word with us? 1 or 2 minutes, please. My apologies. I am not sure if Michael Buckler is online. Please go ahead.
Oh, Tashi Dilek, all the eminent professors, Carole and Gabriel, Lafitte, and Nikki, and Gallous. I have heard through our friend a few days ago that they are going to have a webinar on Tibet, and the topic of the Chinese Tibet situation might be Africa's tomorrow. This topic is very interesting, and it has been said and detailed how the colonialism carried out in Tibet and Xinjiang, South Mongolian. Now it is about to Chinese hardliners think that they are in the final stage, which is the total Sinization of the Tibetan, Mongolian, and Uyghurs. I think they are quite fast to believe that they are get the final victory. But for the African friends, I would like to remind that the Chinese came to Tibet, like other European colonizers in Africa. They came to with the civilization and mission, and they sold us economic development, modernization, and even the Prime Minister His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the first Chairman Mao Zedong's meeting that the Chinese were not going to stay in Tibet. They just come to help Tibet to develop and modernize the country. Now today, Chinese behave like they are a colonial master, and they think the people of Tibet they're deprived of fundamental rights, and Chinese think the Tibetan people is their possession. They don't have any right and basic freedoms. So my African friends, through this opportunity, I would like to just remind you please be careful. You are right to develop. You have to right to deal with China. But the Chinese slogan, win-win, the proposition is China's double win. At the end, Africa might be like tomorrow, today's Tibet. So don't change your colonial master. Be free and stay independent nation and fight for your respective nation's country. And I hope in the future I can come to Africa, and you have got lots of francophone countries, and I would like to highlight Tibet history and current situation and Tibetan people's aspiration for future, and to create more deeper understanding of Tibet, Tibetan culture, and to advance together to fight injustice and violation of human rights. And especially I have a special words would like to see you online today. So I am looking forward to cooperate with you in the coming years, because I'm supposed to be theoretically a member of parliament from the constituency of Europe and Africa, but Africa is 54 countries, so it's difficult to cover up all countries, but I will try my best. Okay, thank you very much
Okay,
for having me. You.
Thank you so much to Tubten Gyatso. Pardon me for my accent or the phonetic from my side.
Very much correct. Correct pronunciation, Ata.
All right, thank you so much, Godubla. Now I feel like I can work in the presidency. Anyway, I'm not sure if Michael Bakla is online. If he's not online, colleagues, we're going to end this webinar now. Professor Carole, thank you so much for the sacrifice. You and thank you also, Gabriel. The time difference has been so much of a hurdle with us, but you guys had to sacrifice. We came to a compromise. Our conversation around the coffee that I said I will order online is still alive. Let me just run to the birthday party, and then we will talk about that coffee. Hopefully in the coming days, you will get a cup of coffee of your choice in front of your door. That I promise. Thank you. It's my own positive energy towards the huge sacrifice that you are doing for the people of Tibet. We look forward also having Tubten Gyatso with all of you in Africa, so that we can introduce him to Francophone communities, that he can spread the message, because if the Tibetan question is so much alive and important for African societies to be able to reflect on it, such that we can put in our guards to not be able to be eaten completely alive, because it has already started. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year to you all. May you all arrive 2022 with good health and good strength. And let's not forget, Tibet is still there. The question is not resolved. We are called to resolve it. Thank you, guys. Have a pleasant day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Professor Carole Lafitte. Tubdenla, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.